The things that have bubbled up, what I've heard, the value of clear, measurable outcomes that the Green Book represents. Everyone is very, very supportive of that. And that when those actions are built in from the outset, it's exciting, it's generative, it speaks to using the imagination, which is what we all came for, which is what theatre is for. That it costs time, labour, planning, and that theatre works at speed. So there's a real tension between ambition, desire, practical, and time. That we are entirely cognizant of the equity equation at the centre of climate action. I'm left with, don't let staging contradict the content, and what we want from today are specific, measurable, time-bound, realistic, achievable outputs. So I'm not going to go into the lots of things. I could quote back all sorts of stuff, but I really want to get to the questions, if that's okay. So, I've got so many. I'm going to start with, let's start with the National Grid, actually. Let's start with that. And actually, I'm going to broaden it out a bit. Because at the end, we had National Grid. Here's a way that we can share resource. We had conversations about how we can share resource in other ways. And actually, it's all about what is the system, what is the process for the sector, the whole, to share the knowledge and the resources across the whole sector. That's really what's at the bottom of all of this. So going to the National Grid, Rufus, what does it mean for, well, first of all, what are your responses to that idea? And also, what would it mean for artistic opportunities within that?
Can I talk to the sharing more broadly?
Yes.
And the reason for that is partly because I'd love to sit down with Sean and the team from Birmingham to understand a bit more about that. And also, in a way, they have more expertise because there is already some very successful models of this is not from a climate perspective, but just from a financial perspective of co-producing that regional theatres around the UK have evolved. That we have largely, the National Theatre, have largely not really been involved with. So the thinking behind that, of course, we've got our nationwide touring, and I'm very interested to see how that idea might cross over with that. But the storage is something that we've put a fair amount of thought into, and the beginnings of action into. And I've already talked about this a little in the past, and I know some of it's been made public, but I just wanted to talk to that a little as Blanche brought it up, and it came up so often. The idea of a storage hub, somewhere of shared resource, in a way not far from what Vicky was demonstrating at the Biennale, is something that a lot of people have fed into, and a lot of people have been thinking about. Technical directors all over the country have had long practices of actually calling each other up and saying, have you got a Revolve? Or, this, that, and as we've heard, National Theatre, theatre in Scotland is already well ahead in terms of just the kind of dyed-in-the-wool practice of this. So we decided to do a little bit of work on this and did a 2-year study funded by the GLA into what actually is there a business model. There is no now recycling theatre building company. There was one, it's gone bankrupt.
And that tells a story, right?
Well, exactly. You just, these things have to be thought about thoroughly. Anyway, the upshot of this 2-year plan, 2-year deep dive, was broadly very positive. Is Paul Handley here? Yeah. If there are any questions, I'm going to give a brief overview. If there's any detailed questions, it is much better if Paul leads on this. Actually, can I just have a shout out for technical directors? It's really, and it's Dave, Gemma, Paul, a lot of this has happened because of the engagement of the technical directors in this debate. And it's really, really clear that the organisations yes, the artistic director's got to be involved, the exec director's got to be involved there, but it's so crucial that for the foundation of this, all these brilliant ideas to happen, the technical director is a really, really key player within that. Anyway, what we're doing is we're taking over a storage site in Bermondsey. It's just down the road, unlike all of our previous storage sites, and we're bringing all our storage together. We're also working out how we share that resource with the Royal Court, with their costume supply. Their costume store. We're bringing our costume and props hire into there, and we're talking with the Young Vic and the Almeida and the Kiln also about that, so that we embed sharing the practice. But this is a kind of blueprint or a test for a much bigger idea, which we are exploring at the moment, which is to take on. No, we're not going to take it on. To be part of a collective, and we do need politicians to be behind this, and we need the GLA to be behind it, and we need developers, architects, and the rest to take on a huge plot and really look into this on a large scale level. As has been pointed out, the answer is not to have one just outside or in London. It's to have.
And as well as having lots of different spaces to make it regionally equitable, Scotland also the Scottish team also talked to how to keep the knowledge, and not lose it between generations. So outgoing leadership goes, a practice disappears, funding breaks down. And so what's the answer? I'm going to open that up, if you don't mind, to making sure that we have not just I'm going to call it a pilot. I feel it's a lot bigger than a pilot, but an exercise that goes, can this work amongst us? Also needs to take in the equity model. How does that work with the smaller scale organizations? But also, how do you make that very practice, that very system, sustainable? If we're going to do that, over to both of you, what's the model for making that sustainable? Whether it's National Grid or the Biennale model or all of those examples, how do we make it really sustainable?
I think the heart of the question for me, a thought that's been rolling around my head a lot listening to everything today, sort of been thinking of the 20-odd years I've been making theatre in different contexts. Over that time, I've seen all of our organizations very self-consciously come to resemble commercial organizations much more, and to come to be much better at being commercial organizations, to come to understand things like dynamic pricing, loyalty models in developing audiences, all of those spaces. And we aren't commercial organizations. In the main, we're charities. And the commercial model for a charity is an odd way to understand. And when you hear about the thing that people are describing, like 25 people with their eyes closed, each touching a different bit of an elephant and going, what is it? The thing that we're trying to describe and going, it needs to be this and it needs to be that, is not a commercial organization. It's a mycelium network. It's an exchange of nutrients. It's an exchange of information. It's an exchange of flow. So I think the change for us on an organizational level, and this is very much, in the prism of the artistic director and in the prism of the person within the organization, is how do we reconfigure our organizations? How do we reconfigure the relationships within our organizations so that we understand that, yes, we need at moments to act in commercial ways, but fundamentally we need to be doing something else, which is about being the right contributors within our niche of an ecosystem. And as with a mycelium network, knowing that's not limited to species, it's not Birmingham Rep and the Royal Exchange and Leeds Playhouse as very similar entities sharing with each other. It's the prop store and the fringe theatre and the non-building based national theatre and the independent artist and the freelancer and the senior pro and the newbie, all being able to find a way of going, this is how I contribute in this moment and this is how I am nourished in this moment.
Yes. So I think you've outlined the question. How do we make a collaborative and transparent resource sharing? I'm really struck that Max, yes, I do want you to answer that question. I'm really struck, Max said at one point, so if anyone does know where I can get hold of some trees. And I was actually thinking, I can think of a couple of productions, but that's not the way that we should be doing it, right? So how do we do the collaborative, transparent, so that those smaller agents can actually take from the larger agents and use without being already in that network? You said Royal Court. I totally understand the partnerships in that, but actually there's the high tides and what have you. So
I think in Scotland we're really fortunate because we're a relatively small nation who's incredibly collegiate and incredibly networked. And there's something about an egalitarian spirit of Scotland that does generate positive collaborative working. But if Rufus was allowed to talk about something as kind of technically boring as storage, I'm going to say database, which I think is equal to. There's a phenomenal, and again, a shout out to the production managers. There's a phenomenal production manager from Scotland, Craig Fleming, who's developing a model for data sharing, which again sounds not exactly like a glamorous vision-based solution, but actually it's an incredible resource for building a picture of who has what, but also building the models, sharing information around the producing models, because something I've heard today is the leadership comes from the models around which the work are made. And the model for that will involve subscription with a proportionate level of resource being put into that depending on the turnover of the organisations, so that the larger organisations are effectively supporting the information sharing from the smaller organisations. And it's at a pilot phase at the moment, but there's something around how do you take the principles of sharing collegiate working. We were laughing earlier about in Scotland how there's just a constant flow of material out across from NTS to the building-based organisations and the producing venues across Scotland. And how do you sort of take that principle and apply technological formalisation to that? And I think it is possible.
And that's really exciting, and I hope that feels like something that the rest of the UK might learn from in a similar way that the Future Generations Act feels like a very appealing part of an answer. Yeah. Not going to say it's the answer. So you kind of touched on my next question, which is what role does big theatre, as I'm calling you, have in supporting smaller theatre beyond materials? That's what I want to go to now. So we're talking a lot about materials. All of the displays outside talk about this is not just about materials, right? It's funding, it's resources, it's the conversation, it's the administration, it's all of that. So I'm going to start with you, Lorne, and work my way across. We're interrogating the movement of materials, widening out the lens a bit to all of climate justice and climate action. What role do you feel that you have in supporting smaller theatre, or is that just too onerous to feel like that?
I think it's not only not onerous, it's fundamental, and it enlivens and empowers you as an organisation. So I think
what does that look like for you to deliver that?
I think it starts with structure and transparency. So things like, and it's a very small thing, on Friday in our offices we run an open hot desk scheme for anyone who wants to do it. And as part of the offer, if there's anyone in the organisation that a freelancer wants to talk to in order to be able to draw on skills, networks, whatever else, that's part of the offer. So anyone can apply. You come in, however many desks are available, and then anyone who's in the office, or people build their schedule to be in the office, to be available around the people who want to talk to them. So you're just starting to go, here is the intellectual and the social capital that belongs to you, yep. And here is the regular offer of how you gain access to that.
Okay, so there's a comfort with the obligation, and I want to take this to Rufus and go a bit further. We've talked about the wonderful commitment, obligation we have with audience to basically say, just imagine, fill in the gaps, that's what you're here for. We don't need to literally make every single bit of this story real. And I want to understand what obligations you have to build or create big scenes, actually fill the stage with stuff if you are in a big stage. Is that not a real thing, or is there an obligation that you've got so many square foot, so you'd best create an amazing set?
I don't know. I mean, I think that I would say.
The audience is going to react if you go, actually, I'm just going to strip it down, and it's going to be mostly one person, solo show, just the lighting.
I think that they would be fine if it was the one person that they wanted to see. I'm afraid to say that if you're selling 1,100 seats, it's going to depend on who that one person is.
Yeah.
And I think what audiences want is variety. As Sean was saying, this isn't just about the range of work that any theatre tries to put on is for their audience. It is about the audience. It would be. I'm intrigued trying to work out, sitting there, whether Vicky's palimpsest season, the 5 things. You go, oh God, have I got time to, make that. Dig into that one. I think there's a huge amount of imagination that can be brought to it. I don't think the answer is to have no staff at all. Our industry is full of brilliant designers. I think the answer is to by sharing, by taking forward a lot of the ideas that have come up today. I think we can build a circular economy that still enables us to make extraordinary visual spectacle as well.
I'm quite excited about marrying Vicky's idea with the database as well. That it's not just 5,
exactly.
That it goes on
That's
and on
exactly
and on.
it. In a way, that's the point of the storage, is to go, you want 5 revolves on stage?
Yes.
What size? Here they are.
So,
and to have a green fleet that can answer some of the transport issues around it.
Yes, and that transport, in fact, let me come to that one. I mean, sometimes in the conversation we've heard, it feels like touring is almost impossible. And I want to drill down into that with the demands. Somebody earlier talked about the terms and conditions, the agency that freelance directors might have in coming into a space and saying, these are my green criteria by which I work, so you meet my work practices. How viable is that for freelance directors to come into spaces, your spaces, with what I've called climate terms and conditions? I mean, is that viable? Does that work? Feels like a nightmare, just being honest. Well, okay. Let me unpack that a little bit. Let's look at catering, right? This is not just about movement of materials. Let's talk about procurement. To be really climate aware around procurement, Director A might say, actually, I want to go with locally sourced produce, and you go, yeah, excellently. And then Director B, excellent. Director B comes in and says, actually, my show is about marginalised Caribbean communities, so I want to work with a Caribbean caterer. It's a small example, bear with me. So you've got 2 directors in a space, same season, one's locally sourced, one's Caribbean. Caribbean food is never going to be locally sourced this time anywhere. You are going to be leading on all
this
of
is like
these
a
individual
computer game.
Absolutely, but it is. That's why I say that's my shorthand for that's why it seems like a nightmare. So back to the question of how viable is that, looking at the whole piece, not just about materials, but all of it, the procurement, the catering, the hospitality, the transportation, the messaging, all of it. How viable is it for freelance directors to come to large organisations with their climate terms and conditions?
I can speak to that. I think what I loved that my colleague Gemma talked about this morning about the Green Book is about it being okay to try and fail, it being okay, like all of us being collectively in a space of systemic change, and there needs to be the ask, and there needs to be enough honest, authentic, trusting dialogue around trying, and actually the spaces of failure and the spaces of it not quite working also being quite interesting. and about it not being a. I think there can be a kind of practical nervousness about the Green Book, as though it's like another thing to deal with, and actually it's a kind of wonderful iterative, experimental, collaborative, generative tool to try and sometimes fail. So therefore, in that space, all questions and all asks are viable.
And I think it's lovely that that came out very clearly across the day, that it is a starting point. And if you start with the Green Book from inception, it feels a lot easier to deliver it. I think that's a fantastic takeaway that I personally get very excited about. I want to talk again to scale, you know, the big organizations on the stage, the individuals out there who engage with you. And I want to ask about your role in making action and climate action a given. What is your role thinking about advocacy, funding, legislation, etc.? How much is yours to do? How much isn't? I'm going to go, okay. I'd love to go 1, 2, 3, if I may.
I think our responsibility is about making public commitments, whether that's to our audiences or our funders or our stakeholders or our politicians, but critically to our artists, of going, these are the things that we're trying to do and how we're trying to do them. And in that, there was a beautiful phrase, forgive me, I forget who said it today, but a version of yes, for the artists coming and talking to us, a public commitment from us that we will always strive for a version of yes, and that against our own parameters, our own restrictions of finance, of time, of everything else, that, you know, for our imagined person who needs West Indian catering, of course there's a version of yes. And then we have to travel towards that. And that the response to the provocation around climate that we're inviting and desperate for our freelancers and artists to bring to it, that the counter commitment to that is that we will bring everything we can to the version of yes that works for everyone.
So your feeling is that your position on advocacy and wider advocacy beyond the work in hand really exists in the relationship between you and the artist?
I think it exists between us and the artist, and it exists between us and taking the responsibility for setting a wider expectation of going, these are the things that we are going to do, and reaching beyond what seems possible now. Going, the thing that doesn't seem possible now, we're going to do that. And when that becomes the norm, when that becomes the established, then we're going to reach beyond it again. And to say to the artists who we work with, that's, you're part of that journey, and what we need from you is the provocation and the challenge about how we get there, how quickly we get there, with what ambition and with what new ways we get there.
Okay, Jackie.
Yeah, I was just really struck by something Gavin said earlier about storytelling being a superpower, and then somebody else said something about the artist, where artists lead, others will follow. And for me, it feels like there is such a misfit between the importance of artists and storytelling and the possibility of artists and culture generally leading the change here in this existential crossroads that we're facing. And Chloe was talking about Rob Hopkins, and I'd mentioned him earlier. And Rob Hopkins talks about the fact that the thing about the climate emergency is that it actually is shrinking our brains because it's giving us fight or flight. And when you're in fight or flight as a society, then you have the least possible. Your imagination is functioning at its least effective if anybody's in fight or flight. And the role of artists seems to be getting us out of that fight or flight mode by helping our imagination. So to go back to the question, for me, the role of the bigger institutions, or for us, or those who do have access to power, is about making the case for the role of artists and the role of culture in this existential moment, to lobby for, the culture receives such a disproportionate amount of funding for the important work that it does. So our role is to lobby and advocate for funding and resource at the highest levels, and we have access to decision making. So it's about using our our influence to articulate the role of arts and the role of artists in generating optimism and generating the possibility of action, creating hope.
And do you feel like the climate narrative is already established within that wider advocacy when you are talking to government and policymakers around, the tiny, very mindful of what's going on with Creative Scotland at the moment? When you're there advocating for funding and resource, is climate already articulated within that? And I'm going to go over to Rufus.
It's quite difficult to talk about that when we can see that the current government are stripping back all of their commitments to try and win the next election.
Yes.
So if I'm going to be completely honest, no, we advocate now like we haven't done for years. That it's on a really, really complex and granular level. The relationships that we're building, not just with government, but also with the opposition and local government. It's something that we're extremely mindful of. It's also difficult because this particular lot are incredibly sensitive. So if you take the other route, which is to publicly criticise, they absolutely close the doors.
You're not going to get anything.
Yeah, which is difficult because is it worth being more activist with a long-term plan, knowing that you're going to lose all your short-term gains? And I don't know what the answer is to that. For the moment, we are advocating rather than being activist. But are we doing that heavily on environmental grounds? No, not with central government. With local government, the GLA, we absolutely are, because there's much more of a conversation to have there, and there's much more of an opportunity for us to be active. To get back to your bigger question, what's our responsibility? Our responsibility is the same as everybody's, which is to do what we can with what we've got where we are. And what we can do is quite a lot compared to lots of other people, but it's finite, so we need to aim at what we can do. And what we can do, we believe, for example, with that storage thing, is to help towards modelling something which can then very quickly become common practice. We've seen real shifts in our industry over the last 10 or 15 years. And obviously, we talk about moves to the commercial, all that kind of stuff. You can look at it in a negative and positive way, but some of it is immensely positive. And that's through people taking action. So wherever we can. And the micro of that, which goes back to your Caribbean kitchen in one rehearsal room, is to respond to the artists coming in and really, on a key point, make sure that we are constantly broadening out the pool who are coming here for the first time, coming here being whatever organisation. So there's constantly fresh provocation.
And that's the thing, I suppose what I'm teasing out is it feels like modelling, you're all aware that there is some modelling to be done, but there's some real tension with how you model that in a bespoke way from delivery to delivery. It's going to be different, and how freelancers engage with that. Where's the consistency in that message? What do we understand is the behaviour of this organisation is the real challenge. I'm looking at that and it suddenly said time's up. I had no countdown. I don't know if that's real. Is my time up? Just like that? Just like that? All right, okay. I wanted to throw in fact I will. I'm going to take 2 minutes to throw it open to go. We came here to shape a pledge. I feel like it's something about behaviours, commitments. What is the commitment we can do in the space? And I just want to hear from the room, just for a bit of energy, and as well to take it away and make it something. I can't hear anything, so I might have to just pick on people. I love doing this. Someone's going to have to say something. I'm going to change who's on your board.
More opportunity for new artists. Some organisations can give as well as receive.
That's very nice, thank you. Oh, don't put your hand up. You're lost if you put your hand up, honestly.
Recognise when you have power and what of it you can give away.
Recognise what you have when you have power and what of it you can give away.
In
Resist making product. Wow. Again? Set swap. I love that too. Any more for any more. Fantastic. Engage new audiences into conversation. And I saw a lurking hand. Don't put your hand up, just shout out.
Build a better understanding of the relationship between climate crisis and equity, global equity.
Thank you. Be angry. I think we can pledge to that. I think that's the answer. Any more for any more?
But in the Green Book, it contracts as standard.
But not front-loading the unpaid work on freelancers.
Wow. Okay. Do you know what?
That's great.
I feel like those two are the piece. Green Book as standard in contracts, because that is the conversation, the dialogue, the being angry, the equity in it. And I do want to go back and go, I really want to refresh my memory on how much equity is acknowledged and articulated in the Green Book. And your piece, sir?
Without front-loading more work on...
Without
unpaid
front-loading more work on unpaid freelancers. See, that's how we're going to come to it. Who knew?
I think develop very strong relationships with any performance arts training program. At foundation level, at undergraduate level, at freshers fair, there has been a big absence and it really needs to be addressed. So my shout out is create for all of us here very strong links, however brief they are, because it's possible to just drop seeds, to quote Grotowski, and from those seeds, new initiatives will flow. But without those links, we start again and again and again. So my encouragement is strong links for any of the organizations with arts and health initiatives. There is an enormous amount happening within the NHS. With trauma and education initiatives, a great deal is happening there, and the conversation that we're having here is at the moment not percolating. So I suggest ripple it out to all other people through talk.
I love that. I absolutely love that. And I've distilled it, if I may, I've distilled it as from inception, which is basically, as you're saying, it starts here, right? So I've got...
When is our next gathering?
Oh, gosh. Now, that's not part of a pledge. I think that's a wider question, to be honest. And I think that's, I'll meet you in the bar afterwards. I just want to say I'm going to hand over to Zoe to articulate this pledge, because it was very much a request. I can't see her. Thank you, everyone, for attending. It's been an incredible day. Please do drop your postcards in the buckets outside. There are staff on hand you can hand them to as well. Please do join us for drinks to carry on this conversation, and do look out for the articulation of that pledge coming your way soon, which will be a combination of green books in contracts, don't front load onto freelancers, and from inception in the theatre ecology. Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank
And
you.
thank you.
Thank you.